Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Hello, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome back to another episode of the Modern Leadership Podcast. It is so good to be with you again. A few weeks ago, I was invited to give a presentation on millennials in the workforce to a group of CFOs. And one of the things I found intriguing during my research and preparation was the general belief that millennials are untrusting. It is difficult to gain their trust and takes only a second to lose it. And it makes sense, right? When you figure millennials, those between age 20 and 35 right now, came of age during an era of corruption. Think back to 2006, 2008. Leaders everywhere, it appeared, were corrupt. Politicians, banks, business leaders, corporate America, and nobody got punished. So think about this for a minute. In the next couple of years, over half the workforce will consist of those with an inherent mistrust of the system. This could be bad, and it's been on my mind. So what better way to get clarity than inviting an expert on self-awareness and compassion to the show? Today's guest expert is Shawn Vij. Shawn is an accomplished business leader with over 25 years of industry and consulting experience. He's held leadership positions at Ford Motor Company, Ernst Young, Visa, Deloitte Consulting, Microsoft, Intel, and other major corporations. Talk about a career with a lot of diversity and an opportunity to see quality leadership in action. Shawn's new book, Moral Fiber: Awakening Corporate Consciousness, which reveals why those who care about the world also often helm highly successful organizations, draws on decades of experience. He maps out why the true health of an organization depends on more than sheer profits. Shawn, it's a timely and necessary topic. Welcome to Modern Leadership. How are you today?
Good, Jake. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is going to be fun because this is a topic that has been on my mind, as I mentioned in the intro, a lot lately, because there seems to be a lot of mistrust and a lot of corruption. It would appear that there's a lot of corruption. And I love this idea of this moral fiber, or how companies and leaders that care about the environment, the world, those around them can really make a big impact. So before we jump into that, did I miss anything in the intro by way of personal or family or what's going on in your life?
No, I appreciate the intro. Thanks, Jake.
All right. Well, then let's talk about this book, Moral Fiber, and how you came up with the idea or what you saw in corporate America that really led you down this path. It's
a book on a greedy businessman's journey and how he got awakened, myself. And also it's more about learning. It's not so much on what we attain, but how we attain it, right? And that makes the difference. It's a book really about living our values through what I call conscious capitalism. And in the end, Jake, it's about raising the human condition, right? And so I'm a strong capitalist. I believe in capitalism, but I believe that it needs to have these boundaries, soft boundaries, and sometimes excessive greed can get in the way. And other elements, greed, ignorance, anger, managing through fear, those things can get in the way on pure capitalism in the sense of exchange of goods and overall. And that's what Adam Smith, if you look back in capitalism, that's what it's really about, is raising the human condition. And so that's why I'm a strong advocate of conscious capitalism. But in essence, the book is a journey about how one has gotten awakened, and I've interviewed lots of leading academia in ethics from Harvard, Darden, Wharton, as well as everyone because it impacts everybody from a barista at Starbucks all the way to CEOs. So that's what the book is about.
Well, and you've got a long career in working with these corporations. You've been with some of the top names in the industry. And so this book, does it draw on kind of your history, your development as an individual and what you've learned across your process?
Yeah, it does. That's a very good point. It also touches on, I chose a good 8 to 10 people to interview as well, that crosses on their experience as well, and how they've handled. I mean, we've all been through compromising situations, right? Every day we go through a situation, and one of the biggest things that we have is choice, and so we can choose through fear or we can choose through courage. And I talk about experiences that everyone, and sometimes we don't say anything in the choice, and we just let it slide, thinking that, so that's why, it's raising our level of consciousness within the work environment.
And so take us back now. So you got 25 years of industry experience. Take us back to when you were in college and kind of what you had in your mind of what you wanted to do. What did you set out to do and become at that point early on?
Well, early on, I make a lot of money. and so that was one of the things in college. I would say in undergraduate school, I did engineering, and I was focused work at Ford. I worked on the line, literally on the ground floor, all the way to working at Ford headquarters and working in marketing and planning. And I started getting this. I would say it's twofold. One, and I talk about it in the book as well, is I think a lot of us go through what I call the chapter caging ourselves. So we get into this environment of what we think is good for us. And so we indebt ourselves to the next car, the next house, and so these material possessions, these things we attach ourselves to, and we cage ourselves being indebted to those things, and then the job owns us, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. And then so you end up going into this cycle, and but for me it was that cycle, but it was also cultural influences that also impacted me, what I call social nuances, things that a society kind of influences and commands and demands from us, or thinks, or the perception is that what we think is important. And we sometimes in that process of trying to claim these things or go after these things, we forget ourselves and we start to lose ourselves. And there's lots of studies on this where they call it psychic numbing, ethical fading. So we reach this slippery slope in every environment we're in and the choices we make. And so I go through that a little bit and I dig into that. But yeah, I mean, back in college, I wanted to make a lot of money. I wanted to go into, I went into consulting, made a lot of money. But at the end of the day, was I really happy? And the people I worked with, I looked around and I didn't see them that so happy.
Well, one of the things that you said is you talk about this chapter called caging yourselves, and some of the examples you gave is caging ourselves through some of this spending and some of these material possessions that we have. But as you were talking about that, something crossed my mind, and I think that in the workforce, especially today, oftentimes we cage ourselves by taking on projects or responsibilities that really label us or put us in a certain direction that maybe we can't get out of. Taking a job that not just because of money, but because here's an opportunity that we want to experience, and we go down that road, and because we do, it eliminates certain other opportunities for us. And I think sometimes as young people, as we look at our careers and what we're doing, what we want to do in the future, we have a narrow focus of what we're looking at. So for you, and by the way, for me as well, we went to college with this idea that we're going to go in and we're going to get our education. We're going to come out. We're going to make some money. I mean, that was what we wanted to do. Now with this experience and looking back over it, and we talk about some of the lessons that we learned. And so I wanted to ask you about something that's been on my mind a lot lately. And this is the diminishing or declining level of respect for leadership and management within an organization and how that plays out with some of the research that you've done.
So let me understand the question. So I agree with your comment, but I guess help me understand are you asking what's happening with management and leadership and the decline of what specifically, Jake?
No, I'm actually asking from the other end of the spectrum. So you have these leaders that are out there doing the best that they can. And of course, they're not perfect, but many leaders are trying to do what they think is right. They're not actively trying to do things dishonest or corrupt. But we have this, what I've seen in my experience in the workforce is this declining respect for subordinates towards leadership. So, I don't need to come in on time, or I don't need to follow the dress code. And so, one of the things you talk about is having respect for your people can have exponential payback. And one of the things I want to talk about is, how do we as an organization with leaders, because the listeners of this podcast are leaders, how do we get our followers to show the respect or the level of commitment and loyalty to us that's necessary for us as an organization to move forward?
There's lots of ways, right? And so there are ways where you can, what I would say, because I've interviewed military folks as well, but you can command respect, but the thing that comes to me is earning the respect. So how do you earn one's respect, right? And so the leaders, right, have to also practice what they preach, right? And so if I'm hearing, I bet you've been in those positions where you hear leaders talk and say, you need to be there on time, and if they're not on time, or they're not, acting the way they want others to act, that's a problem. And so that's one, right? So I think that's an important one. I think it's also as important to hold subordinates accountable for not showing up, right? So one, empathy is important as a leader. You need to empathize with your employees. Employees need to empathize with their leaders. But at the same time, I call it tough love and empathy. I'm not talking about hugs and all that. I'm talking about, like a child. You're holding them accountable. So there's a consequence associated by not being in a certain time, or not being doing something, or not following through as you had committed to. So you need to showcase that, right? And so that needs to be part of the culture, if you will. So if you ask me the decline of that, either the person is not loving what they're doing, and they're not in an environment that they feel that love. So that's a flag. So as a leader, that requires introspection. Am I not? I would start taking a look at myself even further and seeing if there's anything that I'm not doing, or I'm not doing as a leader. And second, I'd start looking at, am I holding my employees accountable?
Do you think that there's this culture of declining respect for authority, or do you think that this is something that has always been basically the same throughout history?
Look, it depends on the company. It depends where you're at. It depends on the situation. That's a blanket statement. Do I feel like millennials or the Gen X or the next generation feels less loyal? You said loyalty, right? Or
yeah.
Respect.
Yeah,
loyalty. Yeah, loyalty I think is a tough one. I do think, I agree with when I was back in the 80s, I felt a greater sense of loyalty. And I think that came from the employer, right? And so employees reciprocated as such. Today, as the world gets smaller and competition grows, and I feel like a lot of companies are hiding behind what they call the at-will employment. And so as you see more layoffs happening, of course, you're going to see employees being less loyal because the reciprocation is less. But I look at my father, for example, who's been on a 20-year pension, or a lot of the folks at that age, they're living off pension. People today are like, what is a pension?
Yeah.
Right. So that level of commitment. So I think it goes both ways. And I think, as I believe an employer needs to showcase that commitment further if they plan to increase the attrition and increase the loyalty. So, I don't hold it against anybody. In fact, I talk about it. If you're in a toxic environment and companies are willing to let you go and they preach all this loyalty and they don't act on it, then yeah, you should leave, right? And if it doesn't fit your mold. But there are companies out there that think otherwise, that do believe that, okay, you may not be the right role. You may have found this role, like you were talking about earlier, you may be in this particular role, but it doesn't fit. You went for it. You tried an opportunity, but the employer doesn't, you don't disabandon your own child. You've tried to find the right role for that individual. And there are employers out there, and I started to look for those employers, and there are very few now, and I think they're coming back more so given the desires and wants of millennials. They're starting to see that.
Well, this is a fascinating topic because you went right down a line that I was hoping that you would, because it confirmed my basic belief. And that is, I think that the declining loyalty that we're seeing amongst employees has a lot to do with the declining loyalty that employers are showing out there. And we talk a lot on this podcast about, in 2008, Generation X, which I happen to be a member of Generation X, they were the ones who were laid off. They were in middle management in 2008 and were laid off. And so they've been, reduced in their employment. They've been kind of undercut, and they've had these opportunities taken away from them. And because of that, it's created this lack of, or this diminished loyalty within the workforce. And I think that's so important to understand that a lot of that comes from this reciprocal type of relationship between employer and employee. Now, one thing you started to talk about, and I want to go down that line just a little bit, and that is a toxic work environment. And what is a toxic work environment? How do we know if we're involved in one? And then we know we need to get out of it if we are, but how do we recognize that, and what is it?
look, companies are made up of people, right? People, processes, and organizational structure. And I would say each of these elements contribute to a toxic or a high performing environment, right? And so the work I've been is very focused on the people part, but also at the individual level, where I truly believe the greatest opportunity for change and business impact occurs. And so when you talk about how do we see if we're in a toxic environment, I'd say to gauge this toxicity, I think it requires honesty, self-awareness, and what I would say introspection at an individual level. And we have to ask ourselves, are we living the company's values and our own? And are we compassionate, respectful, and honest and with dealing with colleagues? And then I think another area, and I categorize it, I compartmentalized it to make it easy, right? Obviously, there's lots of things as outcomes but to gauge the toxicity, I kind of broke it down into four things, what I call the 4Ds, 4 diseases: deception, the act of deceiving, making someone believe something's not true; detraction, the act of disparaging, right? We've all been there, where we're belittling the reputation or worth; the gossip, the water cooler gossip; the discrimination, the practice of unfairly treating somebody; and then doubt. A feeling of uncertainty or this lack of conviction. This is what I call the 4Ds, and you can benchmark in a particular vertical or industry that you're in with other companies, talk to other folks, but it just kind of gives you a trajectory to kind of see, okay, am I dealing with leaders that are deceiving and they say one thing and act on the other, But I think so that to me is the outcome. But now to get surgical on what drives those behaviors. I've had the opportunity to meet the Dalai Lama, and I've been working. I've met him a few times actually, and I've been working with his office, and that's what got me leading to writing this book. It was an awakening, if you will, and I started studying Buddhism as well, just kind of looking at Buddhism and looking at my career and looking at business. And one of the things that they talk about in Buddhism, they talk about 3 things that cause this toxicity at the individual level. And I started trying to extrapolate that on and in a business level. And it was anger, greed, and ignorance. And they call this the poisonous cocktail. And these 3 emotions, they drive the derivatives of we've all been in environments where we've been, fear drives, right? Managed through fear. And so I started exploring that, and in my interviews, I started asking those questions. And sure enough, you could always attribute to that, looking at my experiences. So how do we, so now that that these are these outcomes, and now that these are the emotions that drive that, how do we start addressing it, right? So I didn't want to just, bitch and complain. I wanted, okay, so now what, right?
Yeah.
And so
action. Yeah,
action, right? So, I started looking and I started asking people, how did you address these things? How did you go about these things? And I kind of came up with just a simple methodology, in which I call, it's obviously there's a lot more involved, but I call it ACT, if you will, ACT. And you accept the emotion. For example, anger, right? I go into the office, I'm getting angry, I'm talking to an employee, for some reason I'm getting angry. So what's causing that anger? Right. So start exploring, what was it, a deflection because my daughter I didn't get any sleep last night, or could have been something else. What was causing that anger? Right. And then start what I would say, it sounds so simple, but it's in the practice. And then it's cloistering that emotion. So all of them, everybody I've talked to is like, don't let the anger build. Right. Just because it can easily build, and then it invites other elements like ignorance and fear. It invites those things to come to the house. So cloister the emotion and then temper the emotion. And tempering means, so with anger, and this was the aha moment for me. So for anger, use the extreme opposite to temper it, and compassion. For ignorance, it's wisdom. And so it sounds like, really easy, but it's actually like, all right, so I'm going to use compassion. Like, I would never use compassion when I'm angry. That's the last thing I'd go to. I'd want to fight anger with anger. And we all do that in our personal lives, but actually take the opposite and you'll be amazed. You don't see a fireman walk into a fire angry, right? They're doing the complete opposite. And that's what I'm saying here with our emotions, right? And so, when you see, just use the extreme opposite.
This is huge. I love this conversation here because we've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about Buddhism and some of the teachings, and we've had a number of guests that have shared some of their experiences in learning and developing their understanding of this. And I love this idea of the 3 deadly cocktails: anger, greed, and ignorance. And it's interesting that when you break those 3 down, you could see a lot of the problems that we have in the corporate world, a lot of problems that we have with keeping our employees' loyal, or us as employers and leaders, how we react to our employees. You can see a lot of it dials down into those 3 things. And I love your ACT, your accept, cloister, and temper. And the idea behind this is just look at the opposite: anger, compassion, wisdom, ignorance. And I got to tell you, Shawn, we were just a couple of months ago over in Asia. We spent 6 months in Asia, touring through the different countries of Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, and we studied a lot of this Buddhism teachings and some of the teachings of the people. And one thing that was really intriguing to me, and that is enjoying the ride, and not the destination, but the ride. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. You have your 5 values the great leaders share. And they are empathy, compassion, honesty, loyalty, and respect. And we're not going to dive into those because you wrote a great blog article that came out just on Tuesday for the listeners that they can go read up on those. But I want to talk to you about this enjoying the ride and how we can use these 5 values that we have as great leaders to enjoy the ride.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, that's amazing you went there. I need to do a 5-month trip, but or going on this long. I need to get out to Asia soon. But one of the things I think is important is, and then Buddhism teaches, is that we're always thinking about the future or the past, and we live. And when I say the use the exact opposite, I'm not saying just to hit on the use compassion for anger. What Buddhism talks about also is what they call, and I'm not going to get into the details, is what they call the middle way. And it's we cause our own suffering. As human beings, we cause our own suffering. And the Dalai Lama says that. And so it's, our goal is to seek happiness, and happiness comes from what they call, they use the terminology, the middle way. So finding balance. So finding balance in oneself. And so as much as you look in the future, as much as you look in the past, it's about living and being present, living in the moment. And so it's so important to take in and live because we don't know where the future is going to go. And that's the other thing that Buddhism talks about, is this, what I would call impermanence. And so nothing is ever permanent. And we get attached to certain things that we want and desire, and we go after those things. But if you can accept this, what they call impermanence, that things are always going to change, things will never be the same, this will allow you to be able to adapt and change with the change, if you will, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's one of those where that was a big moment for me, is, well, if I do these things, I'm going to get this. And stop thinking about the future. Start embracing where you are, start embracing what you're seeing today. Like, you look outside, take a moment to really gauge. And I think that's, once you start doing that, your self-awareness starts to increase. Your level of awareness and introspection increases. And what's important about that, it shuns these other things like ignorance and this toxicity, because what it allows you to do is to embrace, but also look at, which as leaders is critical, is it allows you to open doors and look at all the different vantage points. So you're not ignorant in making a comprehensive decision or a business decision or a life decision, if you will. It's so important to have those different vantage points. And I think that allows you to do that. It benefits you in that regards as well, but it also benefits you in the sense of really being there. And the people around you also know. Look, I mean, I was at a coffee shop just the other day, and I'm waiting for my Americano, and I look up, and I'd say there's maybe 15 to 18 people in the room. 15 of them were looking at their cell phone. right? The only person and even the barista was looking at the cell phone while making my Americano. So I'm thinking in my head going, are we connected? And if so, to what, right? And it was like, really? Like, are we, and we all, I mean, look around, walk around, go at a restaurant. And it's amazing to see what have we done to our society? What have we done to ourselves? We don't even connect physically in any way, right? And it's amazing. So, I look back and I go, I remember the day where, it was pick up the phone, call the person, go over there, meet the person. And now it's just, so living in the moment is not about living in your cell phone. It's about being present where you're at with everything around you, taking in around you, not taking what your cell phone has in front of you, but everything around you. And that allows you to, it heightens your awareness, which I think is important as individuals for us to grow.
And this conversation really resonates with me, Shawn, because we have a saying as a family. Our motto as a family is everything is figure outable. And when you talk about things like impermanence and the middle way and connecting, it's really about recognizing that we can figure out any solution as long as we work together on it, as long as we're open and working together. Everything is figure outable. Moving forward, we don't need to worry so much about the future. I'm a big believer in having a plan and having goals and shooting for an objective, but not to worry and stress so much about it that it creates paralysis. But to know that you can figure it out, that opportunity and doors will open at the time that they should open. And Shawn, this conversation has been fascinating. I look at the time and I know we only have a few more minutes. Before I let you go, we have a great section at the end of the podcast where we talk about learning from leaders, where we figure out some of the things that you're reading or watching and things that have influenced your life. Are you ready to dial into the learning from leaders section?
Sure.
All right. So how about the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table?
It's called Healing Anger by the Dalai Lama.
Very nice. And do you recommend it?
I totally recommend it. There's another book, Mindfulness by Joseph Goldstein. I recommend that as well.
Very nice. Okay. How about the best movie ever made?
Okay, so the best movie ever made in my mind, I grew up with it, was Braveheart. There's components of it I just truly enjoyed. I enjoyed the movie, but it was something where it talked a lot about leadership and how Wallace was able to, with the passion and the desire. There was just some really good leadership elements I enjoyed about the movie.
And we spent a little bit of time up in Scotland, and we went and checked out some of the museums dedicated to William Wallace, and it was an incredible experience.
So envious, yeah.
Well, you got to do it. Jump on and go visit some of these places. You'll love it. How about your leadership superpower?
I think of folks, when I think of leadership superpower, I actually think of various folks. I look at President Obama, right? I see him and how he's very calm in his responses and his decisions. I look at my father, and how, the level of humility. Leadership doesn't mean you have to be a president. My father was an engineer, but leading a family and balancing all that with his work life, I find that balancing the balance of that of success is also important. So I see my father, I look at the Dalai Lama, I look at Mother Teresa, the level of compassion that they have and how they've earned the respect of so many people. So that, to me, those are leadership powers. And I think taking the best of all those for me and in my given environment and situation is the key.
And I love how you brought all that out, because I look at your leadership superpower as taking everybody else's and starting to synthesize them into one. And so that's great observation there. How about a leadership motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra that you have?
A mantra that I have, and it might be a derivative of what I've read, or what the Dalai Lama has shared with me, but I truly believe true strength, inner strength, comes from suffering. So what I mean by that is we all suffer, but instead of acting as a victim, dive into it to find your strength. We're all resilient as human beings, and we have the power to do that. And so we should choose to build on that inner strength. It's easy to punch back. It's easy to fight back. It's easy to yell back. It's hard for the resilience, the tolerance to find that inner strength. And that's what I believe.
Very nice. And our final question in this section is the best business book ever written.
I wouldn't say it's the best, but it's one of the ones I like is The Fifth Discipline by Drucker. I love organizations and cultures and studying those types of things, but those are the types of books I enjoy. There are many more, but I couldn't say that there's a best one, but that would be one of them.
Well, and we can't go through your whole bookshelf and look at them all, but there's millions of books out there. And so we love to get just a flavor of what you're reading and what you're recommending. So we appreciate anything from Peter Drucker. Before we let you go, Shawn, is there any last bit of advice that you can offer to us? And then how can we find out more about you and pick up a copy of Moral Fiber?
Jake, I truly and sincerely appreciate it. Thank you. And to your listeners, I really appreciate it for having me. And the way you can get the book is you could go to Whole Foods. John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, has endorsed the book. I've done a lot of book signings, so they're available at Whole Foods. They're also available. It's also available at Barnes and Noble, Barnes and Noble regular retail stores, as well as online and college stores, and as well as Amazon. And it's now going to be rolled out at the airport stores. So if you're at the airport, please pick one up at Hudson News. But yeah, that's it. And then the last one is you can get it off Amazon.com, but also my website, moralfiber.world.
Very nice. So we're going to link all of that up on the show notes to this episode. Huge congratulations, Shawn, for getting into the airports and into Whole Foods. I think that's really a neat endorsement that you got there. Not one of our guest experts has come on the show and shared that they have been endorsed by Whole Foods. So that's really neat. Congratulations on all you're doing. And thank you for spending time with us and the Modern Leadership audience.
Thank you, Jake. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, my friends, welcome back. It was great to sit down with Shawn. And how cool is that? This guy hangs out with the Dalai Lama, and he's really dialed in on some of these teachings that he brought to us today. I loved his idea. We talked about it during the show. The 3 things that create this toxic work environment, or the poison cocktail that he talked about, and that is anger, greed, and ignorance. And the more I've thought about this, as I've hung up the call and really put some thought into this, isn't it interesting that a lot of our problems, a lot of the things that go wrong at work, a lot of the obstacles that we're trying to overcome really boil down to those 3 things: anger, greed, or ignorance. And that if we can overcome those 3, the deadly cocktail, how much easier, how much happier, how much loyal our followers will be, how much better our employment and situation will be, and more opportunities will open up to us. And so really appreciate that conversation. There was so much in this episode. We went through the deadly D's that he talked about of a toxic work environment. We talked about empathy and compassion, and we talked about this blog article that is up on the website as we speak. Go ahead and jump over there, jakeacarlson.com. You can read up on this guest post that Shawn Vij sent over for us to increase our learning and knowledge about the moral fiber of corporate America. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about how we as organizations, how we as leaders can create the type of environment that people want to stay with, that people want to work for. And frankly, by being honest, by doing what's right, hey, more opportunities are going to come our way. So again, big shout out, thanks to Shawn for coming on, bringing that knowledge and wisdom to us. Of course, everything we talked about can be found on the show notes for this episode, jakeacarlson.com/ML52, episode 52. And let's go out there and create work environments that are good for our employees, are good for business, are good for our clients. And of course, as I do every week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life, and of course, stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.